Welcome to the Stars Fellow in Alabama, Southern Black Renaissance, which has been organized here at Edel Assanti, featuring 7 artists from the state of Alabama, many of whom are still living and working in and around the Birmingham area specifically. The idea of the exhibition is to take a very expansive cultural phenomenon and to distill it by way of the sculptures, paintings, and other works that are in the show, explaining essentially the evolution of the aesthetic ideas and other sort of methods that were used to express previously unexpressed phenomenon, things that would not have been allowed to basically be said or portrayed in a time of the Jim Crow era, segregation laws and other things that were relevant to these artists in their earlier years of life. I think it's important to understand this exhibition in terms of a very fateful day. In late summer of 1987, Lonnie Hawley introduced Bill Arnett, who was a collector, scholar, and general sort of bon vivant in a way regarding all things artistic, to Thornton Dial. They met in the late summer and essentially began a friendship and a relationship that would change, in my mind, the trajectory of a lot of different art histories. You have Dial, who in 1987 makes this painting called I Can't Understand Myself, and allow us to understand and engage with African American Southern work, aesthetics, and culture on the whole. I think you have to remember that Bill Arnett understood something very significant, which was that in all cultures across time, where you had great art, you had great music. Where you had great music, you had great dance. With great dance came great architecture, etc. So in my mind, this is Dial over and over again in different, very rudimentary kind of renderings of himself, all in the background of this kind of joint, aesthetic, rhythmic kind of paint style that, again, mirrors blues, jazz, the kind of rhythm and sound of things that he would have heard in and around Bessemer, Alabama at the time. Nearly concurrently, Mose Tolliver is making self-portraits, among other subjects, in Montgomery, Alabama. And Mose is a retired worker. He'd had a devastating leg injury and walked with a cane, but that's a little bit neither here nor there, except to say that he worked from his bed, quite literally painting in bed. And this is his sort of fusion of his own sort of physical characteristics. He had sort of gray, kinky hair. And when he would smile, he sort of smiled with his mouth down. But more importantly, he's looking at or thinking about magazines and art books that he's studying and that he has at the house, particularly the works of individuals like Picasso and other Cubists. So this misconception that so-called self-taught artists, vernacular artists, naive artists, primitive artists, all that kind of stuff, it's based on the idea that the individual is not seeing themselves in line with art history, not engaging art history or other larger cultural histories. And the truth couldn't be further from that. This is quite literally the artist fusing himself with one of the most famous artists of the early 20th century. So this is a very significant and early tiger painting by Thornton Dial. As you'll see, a lot of the paintings are either 4x8, 4x4. And in this particular case, this is Dial using what's called splash zone compound, which he would have gotten originally from his brother, who would sneak it out from the pipe factory in his lunchbox. It's a very expensive thing that's used for all kinds of industrial application, particularly to create waterproof seals on either boats or other kind of piping, etc. But he used it texturally to build up, in this case, the form and the outline of the tiger, and of course the figures on either side. I think there's a lot of different things that you can take from this painting, and you also have to remember to never underestimate any of these artists, but particular Dial, in the sophistication of what he's doing, in the sense that every form, every color, every material, every dimensional choice is specific and meaningful. This is a devastatingly interesting painting by Joe Minter. African Americans, or he referred to himself as bugs, right? And he's got the traditional sort of African colors, but that these very small, ultimately, with the history of the world and the structure of the world, these very small and kind of underappreciated insects ultimately leave indelible traces throughout the snow, this sort of whitewashed history. If you want to consider it the basis of thinking behind his entire project, The African Village in America, which he began in 1989, which is a sort of open-air museum to Black accomplishment. So behind me, you'll find a photo mural of the sign that used to welcome visitors to the African Village in America. And he essentially heeded a personal call that was related to the construction of a civil rights museum in Birmingham. And he feared that the foot soldiers, as he referred to them, would be left out of the narrative or out of the story, and that the museum would essentially honor the leaders, people like King, et cetera, but they would again forget all the men and women who were really on the ground level protesting and participating in various strikes, et cetera. So he wanted to create something for them, and it sort of evolved into an open air museum with didactic displays, but also with artistic, of course, expressions. And it's still operating today, although it's really an extension of the artist's home and not necessarily open to the public in the way that a museum would be. This painting, it's called Instinct for Survival. And it's called that because his brother was kidnapped. He was one of the first prisoners in the Gulf War. And when he was kidnapped, Ronald went into the studio and made several iterations of this, which is essentially a prayer to the void, if you will. It's his brother personified by this deer, lost in a black and an unknown landscape with only the moon and some familiar trees. And the idea behind it is that his brother would take on the qualities of the deer, sense of smell, heightened hearing, heightened vision, etc., and essentially use that to deliver himself to safety. At the time when all of this work was sort of coming into existence in the 1980s, in a very formal sense, the traditional sort of divisions of labor that made it so women were generally doing textile-based work in the form of quilts, and the men were generally doing things that were outside in a labor kind of sense. It's a meditation on nostalgia, youth, how good things were, but they were never really that good, and all of those kind of complicated feelings that must come about after years and years of work and artistic kind of expression, and allow us to understand and engage with African American Southern work, aesthetics, and culture on the whole.
Down through the